From Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Americans are watching members of the military patrolling the streets of major cities in the United States of America. I never thought I would utter those words anywhere, let alone on the floor of the United States Senate. Members of the military in our neighborhoods, on our streets, patrolling under authority. What authority? That's the question. That authority has been challenged, and it will continue under challenge because the courts are continuing to decide whether Donald Trump has turned the National Guard into an illegal police force, in effect, to serve his political ends and personal whims. But there is no question as to the facts that members of the military are in major cities, despite clear and consistent objections from governors, from mayors, from police chiefs, from community groups, from citizens across the United States, and yes, from members of the United States Senate. Today in D.C., California, Oregon, and Illinois, these National Guardsmen are not only patrolling the streets, they are aiding and supporting ICE crackdowns, again, despite challenges to their legality. Now, 3 district courts in California, Oregon, and Illinois have said it's illegal. 1 court of appeals has allowed it to go partially forward, but there remains a court order stopping it in Illinois. The litigation will go forward. But here is the threat, the really dire and dangerous threat. President Trump has said that if those challenges prevail, he will invoke the Insurrection Act. He has said if courts, quote, courts or governors delayed the deployment, he will invoke an act that is 217 years old, which was written after the Whiskey Rebellion and the Battle of Wabash, when local police simply didn't exist in most places and were overrun in those areas by the farmers who were objecting to federal taxes. That original Insurrection Act was written at a time when police forces were limited and poorly equipped. And the Insurrection Act provided for federal force when a genuine insurrection, rebellion, armed violence was occurring beyond the control of local or state officials. And that is the point here. The founders found abhorrent the idea that there be a standing military force that could somehow act as a policing mechanism. In fact, they objected, many of them, to a standing army at all. But the concept of a military force defending the United States was that it be aimed at foreign adversaries and enemies. The threats from abroad were its target, not internal policing, not problems of law enforcement within the homeland. And that is precisely what President Trump is using the military now to do. A violation of the Constitution, the spirit and purpose of the Insurrection Act, and the modern-day realities of law enforcement. Those realities are that police forces are the ones equipped and trained to contain the kinds of potential threats in cities or towns or states that purportedly Donald Trump wants to use the military to quell. Well, the simple fact is, on the streets in those neighborhoods, there is no threat of violence that justifies these kinds of police state tactics. The court in Oregon specifically found that in the last weeks and couple of months, there has been no violence on any widespread scale. And the same findings, more or less, have been done by courts in other jurisdictions. But even if there were, police forces there have state-of-the-art weapons, equipment, analysis tools, communication platforms, and training, all that is necessary to do the job of addressing the kind of threat or violence that President Trump seems to feel exists there. There was no such professional force, locally or statewide, when the 9th Congress passed the original Insurrection Act. Today, in the 119th Congress, the problems that law enforcement was designed to address simply are no longer commensurate with the dangers it is creating now. And I will note that I introduced the Insurrection Act of 2024 before the current administration took office. In fact, a Democrat was president at the time. But after the president's decision to deploy active duty Marines along with the National Guard in Los Angeles, I reintroduced this legislation with my colleagues from California and 16 other states. The danger of the president invoking the Insurrection Act is no longer hypothetical or abstract. It is real, it's happening now. The president shows no signs of stopping deployments. They're becoming more widespread, not less. The president's threat to invoke the Insurrection Act is real. It has to be taken as real. And I believe the courts will continue to rule against him, and that he may well use the Insurrection Act as a weapon to expand his deployments and turn these cities and states into armed camps and police states. He will, in short, circumvent both Congress and the judicial system because of the current breadth and expansive powers under the Insurrection Act. When it was written, there was no danger of abuse. Now there is. When 600 armed rebels attacked government troops during the Whiskey Rebellion, there was a need for federal troops there. Nearly 1,000 federal troops, in fact, died at the Battle of Wabash. We're not seeing armed rebels organized to resist federal taxes coming against local police. We're not seeing the troops in a pitched battle with organized rebels here in DC or in Portland or Chicago. What we are seeing is members of the military going through streets in armed vehicles, enabling ICE to crack down. Now, let's be clear. This issue is unrelated to enforcement of our immigration laws. We can advocate strongly that immigration laws be vigorously pursued and prosecuted. It just shouldn't be done by the United States military. We have ICE to do it. And we can be critical of ICE for the kind of masked raids in unmarked cars that occurred just recently at an apartment building in Chicago, taking citizens as well as immigrants out of their apartments. We're here because of the need to specify in the Insurrection Act when it can be invoked. And this measure that I have reintroduced would very simply create checks and balances and limit the executive's authority to deploy troops domestically. Wouldn't interfere at all or relate to his use of troops abroad, outside the boundaries and borders of the United States. It allows Congress to support the President's decision to extend a deployment through a joint resolution of approval, but it requires that he come to Congress for approval after a certain period of time. It requires the Attorney General to certify that alternatives are insufficient, and for the Joint Chiefs of Staff to detail the size, the scope, and the expected duration of deployment, and certify that the forces to be deployed can execute the mission. And it provides for judicial review. It ensures that courts can prohibit flagrant abuse, not substituting their judgment for the President's, but review whether there is a colorable basis for this kind of action. And finally, it clarifies that the original Insurrection Act does not allow the President to suspend habeas corpus and impose martial law or deputize private citizens. The President should have that power to use our military to quell a genuine rebellion, organized and armed, creating violence that cannot be contained by local and state police. It should not enable him to deploy our military willy-nilly because of his unbridled authority under the current law. I have the utmost respect for our National Guard, our Connecticut National Guard. As I say, when you call out the National Guard, you call out America. And they should not be abused to police their fellow citizens, to act as local police in missions that they are not trained or equipped to handle. I fear for the future of our National Guard and the future of our military if the President is emboldened or enabled to use them for partisan political purposes. He has already, I fear, damaged the credibility and trust in our military by deploying them in the way that he has done already. Our National Guard is there when disaster strikes. They help to clear the roads and enable people to go back to their homes. I've seen them in the wake of natural catastrophes be lifesavers, literally, for the people of Connecticut, and I'm sure for others all around America. They are vital to our defense when they are deployed abroad under the President's authority to use them abroad against our enemies, as they are now deployed from Connecticut and elsewhere all around the globe. But we need to stem the tide of executive overreach. We can protect our civil liberties, our communities, and our military by imposing these checks and balances in the Insurrection Act that I have submitted. It well serves the interests of our states, indeed our states' rights, our military, and the traditions and ethos of our great National Guard and active duty military, and it serves the American people in preserving rights and liberties that our founders were zealous to protect. And so, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Armed Services be discharged from further consideration of S 2070, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered and read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. It is an amazing picture to me to see our Democratic colleagues resisting restoration of law and order in these communities across our country, including the nation's capital here, where the Mayor Bowser, has welcomed the deployment of National Guard to help keep the peace and support local law enforcement in enforcing the law. I won't go through the statistics, but one I remember in particular after an episode of carjacking by juveniles who basically had impunity because they weren't prosecuted by the U.S. attorney here in the District of Columbia, the previous U.S. attorney. Once President Trump deployed the National Guard, those carjackings went down 87%. 87%. And as I drive through some of the areas of Washington, D.C., like Barracks Row over near the Marine Barracks, or Lafayette Park, I see more people out enjoying the weather and the beautiful city that we happen to be in, unconcerned for their personal safety now that President Trump has taken this important step to deploy the National Guard. Now, I would just point out to my colleague, he knows this, that the National Guard is organized under state authority ordinarily, under Title 32 of the U.S. Code. But they can be federalized under Title 10, and there's no question that President Trump, as the Commander-in-Chief, has the authority to call up the National Guard to enforce federal law and to protect federal facilities. Federal law applies to the entire nation. It really is amazing to me to see our colleagues on the other side of the aisle employ some of the same arguments made by the pro-slavery states back before the Civil War. This doctrine of nullification is what it was called. It was sort of back in the heyday of states' rights, where the federal law would apply to the nation, but Southern legislators, governors, and members of Congress would say, well, the state has a right to nullify federal law. Well, that obviously is a discarded theory that has no weight whatsoever. President Trump is well within his constitutional bounds to enforce the law, federal law, in cities across the country. In fact, just yesterday, the Ninth Circuit panel authorized President Trump's deployment of the National Guard in Portland, staying the lower court's unlawful order. It's mind-boggling to me to see now Senate Democrats who've sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, like all of us have, are opposing federal efforts to intervene in cities to enforce federal law and to protect federal property, just as they've done here in Washington, D.C. But the response has been dramatically different in cities like Portland or Chicago, led by Democratic mayors. Even though Washington, D.C., Mayor Bowser, I think, is not exactly a rock-ribbed conservative, but she understands the importance of law and order to a prospering city where everybody feels safe. Last year, Portland was ranked the top 3 largest cities in the country, the top 3 large cities with the highest property crime rates, with nearly 1 incident for every 25 residents, a staggering amount. More than 5,000 car thefts were reported across the city of Portland. I can't imagine that any individual resident of Portland or any other crime-ridden city wouldn't welcome the opportunity to live in a safe environment. I encourage the mayor of Portland and the mayors of other blue cities rife with violent crime to look to Mayor Bowser as an example here in D.C. of how to work with the federal government to enforce the laws and make their cities safer. As I indicated earlier, here in the District of Columbia, it's like day and night compared to how it was under the previous administration. Here are some statistics. Compared to 2024, homicides have declined 25%, robberies have gone down 35%, and overall violent crime has gone down by 28%. I already mentioned the reduction in carjackings. So President Trump is making our cities and streets safer by enforcing federal law, and I would hope our Democratic colleagues would not try to thwart those efforts, which will make our cities less safe. And there can be no legitimate argument that President Trump does not have this authority to enforce federal law using federal officials. And we know that this has happened by our various states in the past. For example, during the 4 years of the Biden administration, where we essentially had open borders, Governor Abbott, the Texas governor, ordered the National Guard and the Department of Public Safety to back up the Border Patrol, who are overwhelmed by the open border policies of the Biden administration. Now, they weren't actually doing police work, but they were taking a huge burden off of the Border Patrol that allowed them to do their job and to focus on securing the border. And that's largely what the role that the National Guard is playing now. They're not doing police work. They're supporting local law enforcement, freeing them up so they could do their job to keep their communities safer, something I would think that we would all applaud. So, Mr. President, I object to the unanimous consent request.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President?
The senator from Connecticut.
Before I turn to my distinguished colleague, Senator Welch of Vermont, a few quick points in response. First, I would note my friend from Texas has not mentioned at all the Insurrection Act. My problem is not only with the use of the National Guard as a police force, but even more alarmingly, the potential use of virtually unchecked power under the Insurrection Act. The measure that I seek unanimous consent on is the Insurrection Act that I have offered to provide limits on the president's power if the court should tell him that he can't use the National Guard in the way that he has done, and he makes good on his threat to invoke the Insurrection Act. Second point, the senator from Texas and I have worked together on a number of measures, and I'm proud of the work that we've done. And one area where we agree is that there ought to be law enforcement rigorously and vigorously to stop crime, to deter it, to punish it, and to make sure that our neighborhoods and streets are safer. In fact, he and I both served as attorneys general of our states, and we are both on the Judiciary Committee. The question here is really fighting crime and how best to do it. My feeling is that the best way to fight crime, local and state offenses, is to bolster local and state police forces, not to cut them and the resources supporting them, as President Trump has done. He's, in effect, cut the burn grants from the Department of Justice. He stopped training programs. He has reduced the provisions and programs for equipment. And so the restrictions that are imposed on resources going to the federal government for local and state police were contrary to the goals of fighting crime. Using the National Guard as a substitute for local and state police is not only contrary to law, it's also contradictory to the practical demands of policing, which require a different kind of equipment and training than our National Guard have. And so local and state police ought to be supported as enthusiastically and fully as we can do, and not, in effect, use the National Guard as a quick fix. They won't stay in the District of Columbia for months or years. They are here very temporarily, and if they've accomplished a reduction in crime, the same could have been done by simply providing more resources, more cops on the streets with the equipment that they need to accomplish the same end. We're not talking here about security of our borders. We're not talking about nullification of federal law. We're talking about overreach and possible overuse contrary to the spirit of our federal system of a National Guard force that should be fighting our adversaries abroad or taking care of natural disasters and catastrophes, not employed as local police, which they are not equipped or trained to do as readily as civilian police. With that, I'll turn to my colleague from Vermont.